When we teach life worth living, we're engaging with a diversity of text from a wide array of religious, cultural, and philosophical traditions. And we use a set of course questions as a way of bringing those texts into some sort of coherent conversation with each other and helping students in their own discernment of the shape of a life worth living. That comes with some potential dangers that I want to point out for you. On the one hand, whenever you bring a framework to a text, there's a risk that you're going to have to squeeze it and twist it and at some level misrepresent it to fit it into the framework. That doesn't mean that the framework is not useful or irresponsible. It simply means that we need to be careful and help our students be careful with the ways that we relate to it. The framework of our course questions is a heuristic. It's a pragmatic tool for helping us generate good conversation. It is not the case that we're saying that every great thinker or every individual who ever thinks about the shape of flourishing life has consciously asked these questions or ought to have. It's to say that for us here and now, these questions can be orienting. And we may find places where the questions don't quite fit our readings or our conversation. And those places are educationally valuable because they show us things about the world and about ourselves that it can be helpful to learn. Here's an example. 3 of our course questions are, what does it mean to lead life well? What does it mean for life to go well? And how does a good life feel? And we suggest that pretty much everybody has an answer to these 3 questions. A response to them is just ingredient in a vision of a life worth living. But then you come to somebody like Seneca the Younger, a Stoic, who says circumstances are entirely irrelevant for thinking about the good life. When you're talking about circumstances, you're just not talking about the shape of flourishing life because the shape of flourishing life is virtue and virtue alone. There's a case where the question does not fit Seneca at all, but precisely the fact of its not fitting is educationally helpful. So that's one sort of caution. Remember that these are just a heuristic and that you're going to find places where the questions, the frameworks, whatever frameworks you bring to a text aren't quite going to fit, and those are places for learning. The second caution is that our lives themselves are very complicated, and something like that framework fit question applies to them as well. So as students reflect on their lives, they can develop a habit of thinking that every piece of life and every piece of their vision of a life has to fit neatly into the bucket of one of these questions. And it's important to remember that the actual phenomena of our lives have many different facets built into one. An example here is something like friendship. So I mentioned the 3 questions of what does it mean to lead life well, for life to go well, and how does a good life feel? We say those roughly correspond to 3 important aspects of human life: agency, circumstance, and affect or feeling. Which bucket would you put friendship in? If you want to give a serious treatment at all, you have to recognize that all 3 aspects are at play in a real friendship. It's something that you do. There's no friendship without your active involvement. But just because you like someone, think benevolently of them, or whatever else goes into friendship, doesn't mean you have a friendship unless that person reciprocates. There's a matter of circumstance that's outside of your control. And you can imagine something that had all the hallmarks of friendship, but the participants felt nothing. It was just blank. They didn't have the joy, the frustrations, any of the stuff that goes into a real, actual friendship. Something would be lacking, right? So this is a case where you might find a student who wants to say friendship. It belongs in one of these buckets, or whatever your framework is. We can start to squeeze the real stuff of life into our categories if we're not careful. And so we found over the years that it's helpful to both provide the frameworks and then provide ways of letting students see their limits so that they don't go around trying to force either texts or their world into a straitjacket that's really actually meant to generate reflection and good conversation. As helpful as the agency, circumstance, and affect questions are for sketching out the shape of a vision of a life worth living, they're not the only questions we can and should be asking. They don't cover it all. There are so many other questions out there. Questions like, who do we answer to? Who's the source of our responsibility to lead our lives well? What even is a human being, and what's our place in the world? How should we respond when we fail to lead our lives in a good way? And what do we make of the suffering and injustice that we find in our lives and in the world around us? Questions like these are the entryway into the really big question of what makes life worth living. Getting familiar with these questions, learning how to ask and respond to them, is the starting place for your own reflection, your own discovery of your own vision of a life worth living, and for your ability to have productive, truth-seeking dialogue with others on the question that matters most in our lives.